I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
For years, they sat behind the same desk every weeknight, reading the news in the same calm, practiced voice, until one day the desk had somebody else sitting behind it. Television built these people into something close to family members. Audiences trusted them, scheduled their evenings around them, and then watched them disappear almost overnight. What happened next rarely matched the headlines that announced their exits. A few clawed their way back into relevance through platforms nobody expected. A few are still fighting their old employers in court years later. And at least one spent years building a second career out of nothing more than a microphone and a stubborn refusal to quit talking. What makes these stories interesting isn't just the fall. It's the gap between how each firing was announced to the public and what was actually happening behind the scenes. A network statement might describe an exit as a mutual, amicable parting, while internally the relationship had already curdled into something closer to a divorce. A single tweet sent late at night could undo decades of carefully built credibility in under 48 hours. And in at least one case, a personal tragedy collided with a professional collapse on the very same day, leaving almost no time to process either one separately. This is the story of 6 anchors who lost the biggest jobs of their careers, and what they did with what was left of them. Dan Rather spent 24 years in the chair at the CBS Evening News, a tenure long enough that an entire generation of Americans never knew another face reading them the day's events. He had covered Vietnam, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and nearly every major story of the late 20th century. And by the early 2000s he was one of the most recognizable and trusted journalists alive, a figure whose calm delivery had carried a network through some of the most chaotic news cycles in modern history. In September 2004, a 60 Minutes 2 segment he anchored examined President George W. Bush's service in the Texas Air National Guard, built around documents said to come from the personal files of Bush's late commanding officer, arriving less than 2 months before a closely contested presidential election. Within days, bloggers and document experts raised serious doubts about whether those documents were authentic, pointing to formatting and spacing that looked more like a modern word processor than a 1970s military typewriter. CBS could not verify the documents and admitted it should never have aired them. An independent panel later criticized both the original report and the network's combative defense of it in the days afterward. CBS fired the segment's producer, forced 3 executives to resign, and eased Rather out of the anchor chair the following year, decades earlier than he had ever planned to leave it. He spent the rest of his contract doing reduced, lower-profile assignments for CBS News and 60 Minutes before finally departing the network altogether. He later filed a $70 million lawsuit, arguing CBS had turned him into a scapegoat to protect its own executives and its relationship with the Bush administration, but the case made little headway through the courts and was eventually dismissed on appeal. For a long stretch afterward, Rather's career looked like a cautionary tale, a once trusted institutional figure, pushed out over a story whose underlying facts were never definitively settled either way. He kept working through smaller outlets, hosting an interview program on a niche cable channel that drew nowhere near the audience of his old broadcast. What followed surprised almost everyone who assumed his career was finished. In his 80s, Rather built a second act on platforms that did not exist when he started at CBS decades earlier, writing a widely read newsletter and posting plain-spoken commentary on American politics that found an entirely new, often much younger, audience online. Lines from his posts were repeated and shared by people who had never watched a single broadcast of his original program. In 2024, CBS invited him back for an on-camera interview, his first appearance on the network in nearly 2 decades, where he spoke candidly about how much the abrupt ending had cost him personally and how it still stung. Now in his 90s, he remains active commenting on the news, proof that a forced exit from network television does not always mean the end of the conversation, even if it takes 20 years to find the next one. Keith Olbermann's career reads less like a single story and more like a pattern that kept repeating with different employers attached, almost as if the same conflict simply moved cities and changed networks every few years. He left an early hosting job at MSNBC in frustration in the late 1990s after the program he had built was reshaped around covering the Monica Lewinsky scandal full-time, then was fired from Fox Sports Net in 2001 after reporting that Rupert Murdoch was looking to sell the Los Angeles Dodgers, a story that put him directly at odds with his own employer's ownership. He returned to MSNBC in 2003 to host Countdown, which grew over 8 years into the network's highest-rated program and helped define it as a left-leaning counterweight to Fox News, turning Olbermann into one of cable's most quoted and most polarizing commentators. In 2010, he was suspended without pay for violating the network's rules on political donations after giving money to 3 Democratic candidates, a rule he said he had not even known existed, and months later he abruptly signed off the air for the final time, thanking his audience but pointedly not his bosses, with no real explanation given for why the relationship had ended. He moved to Current TV, was fired again within a year, and won a settlement after suing over it. ESPN brought him back for a sports commentary program in 2013, praising his work and giving him a nightly platform built around his old Sports Center style, and then cancelled the show 2 years later with the same vague corporate language that had ended his other jobs, offering no real explanation beyond a desire to move in a different direction. By the time he resigned from a later ESPN baseball broadcasting role in 2020 over a fresh round of political commentary, the pattern had become something of a running joke in media circles. Wherever Olbermann worked, the relationship eventually ended badly, regardless of how high the ratings climbed in between. Rather than disappearing, he built his own lane. He resurrected Countdown as an independent daily podcast in 2022, free of network standards departments and corporate sponsors who might object to his commentary, reviving familiar segments from his MSNBC days alongside new material covering both politics and sports. The show built a loyal, if considerably smaller, following through platforms like iHeartRadio and YouTube, where he continues to deliver the same blend of pointed political analysis, sports digressions, and dry literary asides that defined his television career decades earlier. No major network has hired him back since, and given the history, it seems unlikely one ever will, but unlike many anchors who simply stopped appearing in public after their final firing, he has never actually stopped working. For 2 decades, Bill O'Reilly's program was the most watched hour on Fox News, drawing several million viewers a night at its peak and making him arguably the most influential cable host in the country, the kind of figure other shows built entire segments around mocking or imitating. That ended in April 2017, when the New York Times reported that he and the network had quietly settled 5 sexual harassment claims against him over the years, totaling roughly $13 million. Facing a wave of advertiser withdrawals and mounting public pressure, Fox fired him within days, even as the network publicly thanked him for 2 decades of service. A 6th settlement, this one for $32 million with a former network legal analyst, came to light only after his departure, deepening the picture of how extensive the payouts had been. O'Reilly denied wrongdoing throughout, but the sheer financial scale of the settlements made the story impossible for the network to ride out quietly. What set his exit apart from many others on this list is how quickly he refused to go silent. Within days of being fired, he launched a subscription podcast called No Spin News from his personal website, betting that a meaningful slice of his television audience would follow him directly rather than simply move on to whoever replaced him. That bet largely paid off. He built an independent media operation around the show, became a frequent on-air guest on the smaller cable network NewsNation, and by early 2026 had launched a new weekly interview podcast through Red Seat Ventures, a production studio that, in an odd twist of corporate history, is now itself owned by Fox. Earlier this year he told his audience he was stepping back briefly to deal with an undisclosed illness, a rare moment of vulnerability from someone who built his entire brand on certainty and control. He never returned to a major network anchor desk, but unlike many anchors whose firings ended their public visibility almost entirely, his never really stopped. Eric Bolling spent roughly a decade as one of the more recognizable faces at Fox News, working his way from a background in commodities trading into a regular seat on the network's panel Show the Five before launching his own late afternoon program, The Specialists, in 2017. In August of that year, HuffPost published allegations from several current and former female colleagues that he had sent them unsolicited explicit text messages, including photos, on separate occasions. Bolling denied the claims through his attorney and filed a $50 million defamation lawsuit against the reporter who broke the story, but Fox suspended him during an internal investigation, and in early September the network announced that the 2 sides had agreed to part ways, cancelling his show in the process. The story took a devastating turn within hours of that announcement, when Bolling's 19-year-old son, a college sophomore in Colorado, was found dead in his apartment. A coroner later ruled the death an accidental overdose involving a mix of drugs. The 2 events, arriving on the same day, were widely covered together, and weeks later Bolling publicly objected when a fellow former Fox host suggested on the record that his firing over the harassment allegations was somehow connected to his son's death, a comment that prompted a public apology once the backlash became unavoidable. Bolling's path back into television was slower and considerably rockier than some of his peers. He hosted a Sunday morning program for a local broadcasting group that was cancelled in early 2021 after facing criticism over segments questioned for spreading COVID-19 misinformation, then spent roughly 3 years as a primetime host at the conservative network Newsmax, where his show was consistently one of the channel's higher-rated programs, before the two sides described a mutual parting in mid-2024 amid declining viewership. He briefly took on a communications and outreach role with a small, citizen journalism media startup in 2025, and currently hosts an independent YouTube and podcast program built around interviews and personal resilience, a noticeably different register from the combative cable persona that first made him famous. He has never returned to a major broadcast network, though he remains a regular presence on smaller conservative platforms. Chris Cuomo built CNN's highest-rated primetime show around a mix of pandemic-era authority and an unusually candid, almost theatrical relationship with his brother, then New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, whom he frequently interviewed on air during the early days of COVID-19. The sibling dynamic was popular with viewers at the time, even drawing some criticism for blurring the line between journalism and family loyalty. That closeness became a serious liability once Andrew Cuomo faced a wave of sexual harassment allegations in 2021. CNN initially allowed Chris to stay on air while barring him from covering the story directly, but later revelations, surfaced through a deposition, showed he had been far more involved behind the scenes than the network had understood, reportedly helping his brother's team strategize and gather information about the women making accusations against him. When a separate, decades-old misconduct allegation from Chris's own earlier years at ABC News surfaced just days later, CNN terminated him entirely, with the network saying it had cause for the firing even before the new allegation arrived. Cuomo did not go quietly. He filed a $125 million arbitration claim against CNN, arguing through his lawyers that he had been made a scapegoat under public and internal pressure rather than fired for genuine cause, a case that has dragged through arbitration and appeals courts for years without full resolution. A New York appeals court rejected his bid to disqualify the arbitrator as recently as late 2025. Professionally, he rebuilt faster than many expected, briefly returning to a SiriusXM radio show he had previously quit, then launching an evening interview program on the smaller cable outlet NewsNation in 2022 that continues to air today under his own name. His audience there is a fraction of what he commanded at CNN's peak, and in interviews he has been candid about how frustrating and unresolved the ongoing legal fight with his former employer remains, even years after the firing that started it. Don Lemon spent roughly 17 years at CNN, rising from correspondent to one of its most prominent anchors, eventually co-hosting the network's flagship morning program, before his firing in April 2023. The dismissal followed a string of controversies that had built up over several years, including widely criticized on-air comments about a Republican presidential candidate's age that critics called sexist and ageist, for which Lemon had publicly apologized and undergone formal training only months earlier, as well as earlier remarks about a women's sports team that drew similar backlash. CNN gave little public explanation for the timing of the firing, announcing it abruptly one morning, and Lemon has said in subsequent interviews that the decision genuinely blindsided him. His attempt at a comeback took an unusual shape. Roughly 8 months after leaving CNN, Lemon struck a content partnership with Elon Musk's social media platform X to launch a new interview program there, positioned publicly as part of the platform's push to court mainstream media talent with promises of full support and a wide-open audience. The arrangement collapsed almost as soon as it began. After Lemon conducted his first interview as part of the deal, a tense 90-minute sit-down with Musk himself covering topics from a recent meeting with Donald Trump to his use of ketamine to content moderation on the platform, Musk cancelled the partnership within hours, before the episode had even formally premiered. Lemon released the interview anyway and continued producing his show independently across YouTube, Instagram, and other platforms, while a representative said he still intended to seek payment for the cancelled deal. He eventually walked away from X entirely in late 2024, saying in a public statement that the platform no longer served the purpose of honest debate he had originally believed it stood for. He has not returned to television since leaving CNN.